Hello, thank you for staying for a panel on GDPR, the most exciting move in our industry ever. Oh my gosh. We are going to try to make this extremely dynamic. My name is Alexandra Deschamps-Sonsino. I am an Internet of Things consultant based in London, but that has almost nothing to do with the things that we're going to be talking about today. So we have a super, I think, exciting panel because it is really all the people who should really be talking about this to you. We're going to start with Gordon. Gordon, who's sat next to Katharine right there. Gordon is a privacy subject matter expert at the Deloitte Analytics Institute, which have, I believe, a table upstairs. Is it on the third floor, right. Gordon?
Right.
Excellent.
First floor.
The Deloitte Analytics Institute is part of Deloitte Germany, and they're a center of expertise at the intersection of business, science, and technology.
Thanks for having me.
We have Sebastian, who's sat right next to him, which is the founder and CEO of Statice, that helps companies to leverage existing data and new private consumer data, customer data in a privacy-preserving manner. Statice use synthetic data, a data clone of original data with no original data points, but all the original statistical properties. Oh my gosh. Whew.
We got to work on that, huh?
Oh my gosh. And then right next to me is Johannes. Johannes is working at Luther. He is one of more than 350 lawyers at Luther, operating in 16 different offices around the world. There are 10 of those offices in Germany. And he specializes in IP, IT, and data protection law. Their office in Berlin specializes in VC and startups, so do talk to him about your IT, IP, privacy issues after this panel. And last but not least, we have Katharine Jarmul. She is founder of Kjam and provides data science and machine learning consulting based in Berlin, correct? Excellent. Oh my gosh, that was great. So that was the last of me writing or reading my notes. We're going to kick off with a very general question on GDPR. And I'm going to ask Sebastian to respond to this first. What do you think are the aspects of GDPR that will affect startups the most?
Good question. I think the first question I would actually have also for the audience is who has actually heard of GDPR so far? It has everybody almost. A couple of people.
Not
all right.
Really. Yep.
So let me start off with a real quick intro to what this means for companies and startups especially. So GDPR is a new regulation coming around next year, requiring companies to be entirely transparent from the start to the end of how they leverage customer data, what they use customer data for, and basically empowering the consumer by asking them, am I allowed to use your data? Am I allowed to use the data for this specific purpose? And am I allowed to use your data to share it with that party? So what does this mean for startups? I think there's one big thing to understand for startups, which is that the GDPR is not just a legal issue. It's actually way more about change management within companies. So you do have companies and startups that have to understand that whatever happens with the GDPR next year is not something you're just going to outsource to your lawyer. It's something you have to actually incorporate in your daily operations by understanding that everything you're doing from now on with any customer data or every private data from your customers has to be transparent and potentially even documented in every way. So what you want to do is to look at two big concepts, which is data privacy by design, and second of all, consent. Data privacy by design means that in your entire product or value chain, you actually have to implement privacy-preserving methodologies and techniques to ensure that the data from your customers is kept private and secure. If you're a company or a startup that has already launched a product, you better now actually get up and check your data value chain. You check where data is being used, where data is being sourced, if you're allowed to source it, and where you share it. If you're actually a startup that's about right now to maybe build a product or in the idea phase, you're quite lucky because what you can do now is make sure to keep privacy as an initial part of your design process when it comes to building up a product in your current stage, in the idea stage, really. For consent, I think that's going to be a really major driver for startups to have to rethink their marketing strategies. What this means is that you have to actively ask every one of your customers or consumers or potential target customers to being able, or that you're allowed to leverage their data in the first place and then use it furthermore for any kind of statistical purposes like direct marketing or using them for your analyses or BI analyses, etc. So you have to make sure that they explicitly tell you, yes, I'm okay with you taking my data and use it for these explicit purposes. And I think that's going to be quite tough for startups to do because they're not trusted entities just yet. So how do you convince customers to actually say, yeah, I'm okay with you using my data, but I actually don't know who you are, and I don't know what you want with that exactly.
Awesome. Sounds great. Katharine, do you have any more thoughts about how much of a challenge this will be to implement for startups?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of my work in data pipelines and automation, and in terms of how we use data and in data engineering space, this is going to change a lot with GDPR. This basically means we need to have an accountability chain, and we need to know who had access to the data, how is it transformed, what different methods do we apply to it, and then how is it potentially used at the end of that pipeline in machine learning. And we have to keep this accountability chain able to access so that if you, as a customer, you say, I want to know what you did with my data, I have to be able to tell you as a startup and say, this is how we processed it, this is the automated decision making that we're doing with it, and this right now is not necessarily built into the tools. So if you're a startup, you might be using machine learning as a service or an API. Can you have visibility into what Google is doing with your data? Perhaps not. So at the end of the day, if you're outsourcing some of the way that you're processing data, you need to try and make sure that you know why you're using that, what it is doing to your data, and then if you've stored it before and afterwards so that you can see the changes that have been happening with using these outside APIs. So that, I think, is one big one. Another one is security. So there's quite a lot of fines in the regulation with any type of security breach. And I think a lot of times with startups, security kind of happens the way testing happens, which is as somebody thinks of it. So I think having an approach to security where you're going to really lock down customer data, you're going to think about pseudo-anonymization, which is part of the regulation. This is essentially that you need to anonymize your customer data on some level. And if you're not doing that right now, or if you haven't thought about separating out personally identifiable information, this is going to be a really key step to cleaning up your database or your data sets or your big data in some way so that you can be prepared when somebody comes and asks, hey, can I see the customer data? Has it been cleaned of names, security numbers, and so forth? And I think these are two really difficult steps for startups that thankfully there's a lot of tools we'll be talking about today that can help you get started with that.
Great. But Johannes, really fundamentally, some people in the room might be thinking, well, we're not based in the EU, or our services are using data that is being serviced in the US, or, you know, how does this affect us because we don't think of ourselves as being based in the European Union?
Well, basically, if you're based outside the EU, you're just fine. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We have a lot of clients in our firm that actually work from outside the EU, and we tell them about the GDPR, and that question actually pops out a lot. It's like, why do I care? Well, the problem is that basically every customer that you focus that is in the EU from outside the EU will lead to you having to adhere to the principles of the GDPR. That's why the GDPR, as we know it today, was discussed so much. You had 3,100 amendments proposed. You had the US Chamber of Commerce, the US government involved. You had lobbying from all the IT companies in Silicon Valley and from the privacy fans on the other side. And that is because of the territorial scope, which is quite tremendous, actually. All of the companies that do not even focus so much on the European customers are also afraid of the GDPR. Now, why is that? In the 1970s, you had a law passed in California, the Clean Air Act. That act had the strongest views on our environmental laws for the automotive industry. Following the passing of that act, all the other states in the US have passed stronger stronger acts with regard to protection of environmental issues. So the world actually is looking fearful at the GDPR because they're afraid of that California effect taking place for data protection worldwide. So privacy by default. If you're building a tech company today in the US and you think about scaling worldwide, which most of the startups are, you already have to look at privacy by default and privacy by design when you set up your idea, even though you're outside the EU and you're not even yet dreaming about having a business here. So the territorial scope is quite tremendous. It's a subject that everyone has to be aware of.
Amazing. And some of the people in the room might be thinking, well, what if I don't do anything? So, Gordon, what are the tools that the European Union has with respects to policing this? And what is really the impact on businesses of doing nothing?
Well, as we already heard, first of all, we have to know what I'm doing, what is my data, how do I process my data, and how can I fit to the requirements of the GDPR. There are tools to manage data governance. There are tools to enforce technical and organizational measures to protect data from my customers like pseudonymization, anonymization, encryption. And there are other technical and operational measures. I guess you can say something to this because it's your startup who is actually developing such
so shameless
solutions.
plug coming in. I'm sorry for that. No, basically, one of the tools, exactly what you mentioned, is what we do at Statice. So what you can do, if you have a lot of customer data lying around, and you have a lot of data from, I don't know, that you gathered throughout the years, it's going to be very difficult to go back and ask every single one in this data set, is it okay if I process your data in the future and use your name and address and maybe your email address to still send you your newsletters, et cetera, et cetera. There are ways, but it's going to be very difficult. So let's say you want to use that data and build a machine learning model on top, or use it for your business intelligence analysis, or even want to use it for research, et cetera. What you can do, and that's what you just mentioned exactly, is to use tools like Statice, for example, where you go ahead and process the data in a way that anonymizes the data. In our case, we use a synthesization algorithm. It allows you to keep the statistical properties of the data and then basically use it for whatever purposes you want to have next. The nice thing about that is with anonymization, pseudonymization, et cetera, that you're by doing so or by using these methodologies bypassing the GDPR because the data is not private anymore. You have no private information you could potentially run into troubles with, and therefore simplifies the use very much. So if it's possible, what you could do, of course, use any tool in the beginning of your value chain, synthesize, analyze, or anonymize the data, and therefore use the process data set throughout later on.
Johannes, can you recommend other tools and other ways in which someone can prepare themselves for GDPR?
Basically, the tools come in at the third stage when we advise big companies on how they can adhere to the principles of the GDPR and the GDPR and be safe of the tremendous fines that are lurking around the corner. The first step, and I think you said that, Gordon, is also you have to tell the companies, know your data. So the first step will actually be the audit phase, which is like, which data do I take from whom? How long do I store it? When do I delete it? Which old sets of data do I have, somewhere in the drawer? And from that step, you go on, how do I process that data? And then you compare it to how would I have to do that under the regulation of the GDPR? And when you have that comparison and you see all the discrepancies, then it's perfect to have tools like that that allow you to actually then implement changes that'll make you coherent with GDPR. So that is when we tell people you have to find technical tools because you've got a choice, right? You can delete the data that you're not allowed to have anymore under GDPR because it's not under the purpose that you first collected it for. You can either delete it or you anonymize it by maintaining as much value as you can from that data and go on using it. That's basically the choice.
I would like to underline this, and if you're asking for procedures, for example, or a playbook, how to implement it, it's exactly what you said. It's like you have to take a step back and get an organizational perspective. In the past, data privacy questions were only a question for general counsels and the data protection officer. Now it's more for a technology and a digital perspective. Means not only your CIO, only your chief technical officer has to implement privacy by design with measures you have already described. And the data perspective as well is important. Means you have to know where is your data, how does my data governance look like, can I maybe enforce the purpose limitation by a metadata management and so on. So you have to bring all these three kinds of perspective together and then to make an assessment. What am I doing? Am I compliant to the GDPR? And then to derive measures. We all know you have only 160 days left until the GDPR
160, everyone.
comes into action. So you have to prioritize. So what is the most important step I have to make? Do I have to redesign my consents? Do I have to redesign my databases? Do I have to implement some tools, for example, data synthesization or pseudonymization? But you have this perspective, data, technology, and legal. That's something totally different to the past.
Can I get you to give us and give the audience here some practical places to go to? I want to see in a short list all of the things I need to do or all of the things I need to consider. Are there resources and URLs that you can share with the people in the room right now that they can go to? Any one of you? Because this is an extra question.
Luther is a good law firm. Deloitte is a good consulting agency.
Statice.io, sorry.
Yeah?
If you want to get more afraid, you can go to our website. We've just published some paper on where the biggest fines are to be met at the moment.
No. So, to be honest, the ICO is a UK agency. It's a data protection agency. It has a very good website to get a first quick introduction into the GDPR with all the relevant context knowledge you have to know how to fit to the new requirements. But to be honest, to make a methodological GDPR readiness assessment, you need more. It's not something you can do on your own.
And so for a startup who doesn't know where to start, then they would read the white paper on the Luther blog to get freaked out about how much money they're going to be fined. And then?
First you need to get freaked out and then inform yourself. So you can do the freaking out bit and the information bit on the Luther webpage. But also, for example, podcasts. There's one guy, he's also advertising a service. But he's on the podcast, he's the GDPR guy. And he actually takes it from a very simple level, just explaining all the different aspects of what you have to look at in the future, and make simple explanations. And that's about 10 minutes an episode. That's quite nice if you want to get in touch with more information on a very simple manner. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. Can I get, I guess, Katharine, to sort of think around whether GDPR goes too far from your perspective? Or not far enough, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think that this is a big debate within the data science space and machine learning space. There's been a lot of debate about if there is a right to an explanation. And this is something that I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if there's a right to an explanation. I have read several legal papers on it, and I've also read some explanatory versions of it that is like, perhaps we know the state of the system, we know how the system behaves, and then we can explain the way the system behaves. This is essentially our model that we're using. And maybe that's good enough, right? Maybe I don't have to exactly tell you why we denied your credit or why we made this decision about you as a person. There are some other debates that is actually required. And the unfortunate thing is that with a lot of the ways that we're using machine learning, particularly deep learning, they're not necessarily easily interpretable. So something that I've been talking a lot about, and that is also at a lot of the deep learning and machine learning conferences, is interpretability of models. So how can we better interpret our machine learning models? This will help us with GDPR in a sense of, I can tell you exactly why we made some sort of automated decision, because I can actually look at the internals of my model and see what it has learned. So I would say this is something that the community needs to move forward with, and as a research and academics we need to move forward with. There are some great tools, particularly in Python, that are already available. But I would say in some cases GDPR does not go far enough. And the reason I would say this is pseudo-anonymization is not anonymization. So it has been proven, first paper was 10 years ago now, that you can release pseudo-anonymized data. This is the Netflix prize. You can read the paper from Avin Narayanan. And they were able to very easily figure out who the people were in the Netflix prize data set. Now, this is data that Netflix released, and they're like, oh, it's fine. There's no way you'll be able to de-anonymize it, and if so, it's your own reviews. So it doesn't matter, right? And these researchers, they were then at the University of Texas, were like, oh, we gotcha. We were able to look at the statistical properties of the data, and via k-means anonymization, we were able to say, hey, this is probably this person. And I think that on some level, pseudo-anonymization is not enough. If we care about data privacy, and if you care about your customers' data, you should think about not selling it, and you should think about really anonymizing it if you're going to release it to the public in any way, shape, or form.
Any other thoughts on this, Gordon?
I would like to underline what you said about the discrimination of algorithm. We know that because of machine learning, algorithms can discriminate people or come to false conclusions about people, and these conclusions could be very harsh if this algorithm is deciding if I'm getting my loan or not, or if I get an invitation for a job interview or not. That's the reality. And I guess the GDPR is not going far enough to get informed what the algorithm is doing. Not what is the algorithm, but what it's doing and what are the categories on which the algorithm is deciding not if I get an invitation or not, on one hand. On the other hand, I will give you one example on which point the GDPR goes too far. It's the right for data portability. It says that every one of you who is developing an app, for example, a fitness app, has to offer that your customer is able to take all the data in a machine-readable format to take this data to another fitness app, to another fitness app service. We know they had Facebook in mind, or Twitter, or whatever, but not the average service provider. But this service, or this right, everyone is infected of this right, and everyone has to have the possibility to give this information to the customer, and it goes far. It's too far.
Johannes.
Just to add on that point, that is one point where whenever we give presentations on the GDPR, people are just flabbergasted. Because if you think you're in the market, you have a lot of customers, then you think already just because you're longer on the market, you have more data. And that's an advantage that the other one can't recoup ever. But if you have the right as a customer to take all of your data to the new biggest competitor, then that advantage of you being longer in the market and having the bigger data sets, that can end really quick if, for example, your competitor has a better investor with more money and can realize lower prices. And for me as a customer, it's easy to just switch, and the new guy is going to know as much about me and be able to provide the services as good as the old one. That's actually dangerous, and that'll mix up the market possibly.
And I actually think this is a great benefit for startups, because I can be a startup and I can say, hey, I want to build the new Gmail. Are you sick of Google having all of your data and doing ads? Then you can come to me, and I'm building that. So for startups, I think this is kind of a game changer, maybe.
Sebastian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what the interesting point about the GDPR overall is that there's a lot of room for interpretation still at the moment. Like the legal text, as it seems, it does leave a lot of sort of loopholes in a way where you could not quite sure what's exactly defined. If you look at pseudonymized data, for example, what it also says, yes, you are actually exempt from the GDPR if you use pseudonymized data, but not if it can be linked with other data sources and thus be re-identified. So this already says, yeah, be careful, you could technically use it, but not sure if it's going to work. So I think there are going to be two big waves of impact coming in the future. First, once it actually will come into action, so May next year. And the second wave is going to come once there are going to be lawsuits, when there actually is going to be prosecutions on what's happening, how companies will have to face and deal with potential threats. Because, again, we mentioned that before, the fines that you got to pay are horrendous, like quite high. I think it's what, 4% of your revenue, global revenue. or 20 million if whatever is the higher.
Whatever is higher, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you can imagine that this actually bites, and this can really hurt, especially when you're an SME or even a startup. I mean, that could technically kill you.
Can we just get a definition of who exactly is going after you? Are you on, is it March 20, March
20, no, it's actually May 25, 2018.
May 25, 2018.
Deadline.
On May 26th is the European Union sending you a letter in the post. Is it your local government? Who is there to fine you? And how is that mechanism organized?
Well, basically, it'll be the local authority that's in charge of taking care of the implementation of the GDPR. So in Germany, it'll be the Datenschutzbehörde, which is regional, and they're going to approach you. And mostly what they'll be looking at, I guess, in the beginning, is actually start a discussion about how you're processing data and how your model is. And then they're going to see whether you're in violent, breach of the GDPR, or whether you've carefully documented every step on the way in order to avoid being in breach. And if then you breach, then the fine is going to be much lower, if even there's going to be a fine. But if you're ignoring, and I mean 50% of the companies right now in Germany are still ignoring the GDPR. And if you're doing that and blindfoldedly continuing with your business model, and you're going to be in breach, then you're going to be facing those fines. And again, 4% of the worldwide revenue, we're talking revenue, not profits. That's substantial. And that's why we're also going to see the lawsuits, because if those fines are actually imposed, there's a great incentive to test the question at hand in front of a court to see whether the authority is actually right or not.
I'm going to ask us the last question today, and we will start with Katharine and move on to all of our speakers. Who, in your mind, will win or lose from GDPR?
I think that there are several things that, including what we talked about with data portability, that will mean that GDPR, if implemented correctly, and if giving customers the right to choose who has their data, who does not have access to their data, and respect, essentially, like, if you're a startup and you can say, we ethically source our data, we're not going to sell it to anybody, we're going to anonymize it, and we make sure that we're going to keep it as private as we can, then I would much rather trust you with my data than somebody that I know is already selling it. And so I would say startups, if you can take this ethos, if you can take this privacy by design, there is a good chance that you can win big with GDPR in the sense of both data portability and also I feel like giving the consumers a choice. Give them a choice to be somewhere where you promise not to sell their data. Give them a choice to be somewhere where you promise to anonymize their data properly and secure it properly. And so I think that's a big opportunity, and hopefully we'll see more of that throughout the next decade, I would say.
Gordon.
Well, I guess the winner are the small and the big businesses in Europe, because now we have an equivalence of weapons. In the past, the US data-driven companies has a big advantage in processing the personal data from Europeans in their domain on their rules. Now everybody has to play on the same rules. So we are now on the background of the war on digitalization. The first half of the game we lost. But on the second half of this game, now we have an equivalence of weapons. And we were few weeks ago in New York at the Strata Hadoop, and everybody is talking about GDPR and how to get compliant and how to adjust their businesses to be in the game here in Europe. And you see the first results. For example, Microsoft Azure has made a collaboration with Telecom to store their data from the Microsoft Azure cloud here, not in the US, here.
Sebastian.
I'd like to pick up on Katharine's point on startups, because I do believe that there is a great opportunity and great chance for startups really to benefit from what's going to happen. under the condition that they're able to design for trust. So basically really enable themselves to look at the consumer and tell them exactly what you said. Guys, you can trust us. We are really ethical and good with what you're doing. But you have to be able to do that. If you don't do that right, you're going to have a problem. Because if you're unknown and if you're out there and actually have not really proven that what you're doing is working, it's going to be difficult, and I suppose more difficult to not just get customers, but potentially even get business partners, right? Because nowadays you will also have to make sure, or starting next year, you have to make sure that all the people you work with as companies or other partners or processors of your data you work with are compliant with the GDPR. If you can't prove that, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually get customers still. So this whole idea of designing for trust and making sure that what you do is actually compliant is going to be very, very important.
Finally, Johannes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Maybe another aspect. Anyone who has to do anything with IT security is going to be on the safe side now, because you also have to protect the integrity of the data that you collected. So that would be great. Anyone who can advise on being compliant and who offers tools for being compliant with the GDPR, obviously, so you're in a good place there, Sebastian. I guess some of you as well. Is gonna be moving forward. What's the worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario probably that I can imagine is you're a startup, you have a fantastic idea, you've got a spirited leader, and you have an investor on the hook. And throughout the due diligence process of those horrible lawyers, they find out that your technical system is not built, privacy by default and by design, and that you're not compliant with your business model when it comes to GDPR, and they pull out. So the worst thing that can happen is to not, work with it at all. So that people who do that will be on the losing end, for sure.
Amazing. I'd like to thank you all for staying so attentively onto this panel. I'd like to thank Katharine, Gordon, Sebastian, and Johannes for being here today. And again, if you'd like to talk to them and reach out to them, Jarmul, the Deloitte Analytics Institute is upstairs, Statice.io, and Luther.de, is it?
.com.
.com, sorry. And thank you again very much, and enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you.
Thank you.